We've all been amazed by stories of yogis and of practitioners of yoga that can slow their heart rate and their breathing way down through concentration. How does this relate to interpersonal communication? As we move from chapter 2 into chapter 3, when we start considering others, the process of which we consider others is a process that is all cognitive. And in some cases, we can control that, and our perception we can modify. At the same time, the brain likes to take shortcuts, and in those shortcuts of heuristics and of schemas, we find a basis for prejudice and in other types of biases. If we are aware of this, as we're going through chapter 3, we will learn how we can modify that, how we can begin to slow down those processes so we give individuals an opportunity to be who they truly are. As we leave chapter 2, we're going to bring it with us though, because the main point is no matter what, you're always going to be part of that communication triangle that you're in. And that's the part you can control. So let's go ahead and take a look at chapter 3 and see where it leads us.
And here we are in chapter 3. Now, chapter 2 is very important because the only person you actually control in any communication process is yourself. And so that is the reason why the book really starts out focusing on self-reflection, getting to know our own biases, our own prejudices, because we can change that for ourselves. Now in chapter 3, we start to look at the others in the conversation. Let's look at our preview here. The brain and perception, interpreting information, influences of perception, and in-groups and out-groups. I mentioned you don't have to agree with me. And that's important to remember because I'm about ready to disagree with the book. All right. The book talks about how we select what we pay attention to. That we just simply, oh, I'm going to drown everything else out and pay attention here. That doesn't happen. Because the mind is so complex, we can't always pick what we pay attention to. So we don't simply select. But certain things carry more weight. Certain things are more important to us. For instance, our name. If someone says your name from across the room, suddenly you'll hear that. If they say someone else's name, you don't really pick that up because that doesn't have a value to you. So you pick up certain things based off of if it's important to you. If there's a danger in the room and someone yells, "Wild bear," you pay attention to that. Meanwhile, if someone runs into the room and says, "Wild chipmunk," you're not really paying as much attention to that. So we don't necessarily select, but we can practice focusing on information that we're receiving. And part of the reason that we can't just focus and our memories are so varied is oftentimes we like to think of the brain and the five senses as all feeding into one place. That it's just kind of like a movie reel. And, oh, well, I'm just going to go ahead and replay that moment in my mind and it'll come out perfectly. However, as the sensory information is coming in, there's billions upon billions of bits of information flooding our central nervous system. And because there's such a flood of information, our brain has to filter things. And they don't even filter to the same place. As you can see here, we store information throughout our brain. And then when we try to memorize something or recall something, what we have to do is we have to draw a map again and pull that information back. That's going to become important as we start talking about perceiving others. Sensory data from the five senses are overwhelming, as I mentioned. And how does this impact interpersonal communication? It's easier to pay information or pay attention to information that's getting through the filter than things that are being filtered out. It's also easy to be distracted when we're trying to pay attention. Have you ever had anyone tell you to just pay attention to a pencil, just hold it in front of you and look at it and just pay attention to that and focus on nothing else? And don't let anything else cross your mind. What you find out is you can do that about 3 to 5 seconds, and then something comes up in your mind and you lose your focus on the pencil. And it's because we have so much information coming in that it's hard to constantly filter it all out. As we begin to organize information, it either enters short-term and then into long-term memory, or we drop it off. So since the brain stores information throughout the cortex, the process of encoding and retrieval is constantly occurring. This is important in interpersonal communication in that as we're talking to someone, we're trying to focus on what they're saying, but we might be focusing on something else. And then when they ask us to repeat it back, well, we haven't practiced what they were saying, we haven't rehearsed it, so that sensory data isn't there for our retrieval, and we have a hard time communicating at that process, at that time. Some stored data is even modified based on new information. So if someone comes up to you and you're in a good conversation with them, and someone else comes up after that person leaves and points something out about the person, like, oh, they were wearing ugly shoes. And suddenly, you didn't even notice they were wearing ugly shoes. But suddenly you have a memory that, oh yeah, their shoes were ugly. And you've basically changed the information that you've stored. And now when you go back to that person, you're communicating with them again, you're going to find out that you're going to focus on their shoes versus what you were actually intending to focus on. People see things based on their vantage point as well. So when we're talking to others, if we don't agree on something that occurred, then realize it could just be their vantage point. You don't see everything the same way. Their brain is sorting out the data differently than your brain. So rather than saying, oh, I remember this so vividly, and they're like, no, what I recall is, don't get into an argument. Realize that as different people, they have a different vantage point, and that vantage point changes their perception of something that you both shared. This can add to trouble in relationships where you recall something about the first night you met and they recall something totally different. It's okay. Just remember it's a vantage point. As we're starting to perceive others, as we're starting to give them their own identity within the communication process, we also have to start reflect back on ourselves from time to time, and especially how we're attributing things to other people. Interpreting information is very important. As I was mentioning, the brain has stored all this information in different locations, and we have to have that roadmap to bring it back. Well, a schemata is an underlying organizational pattern or structure conceptual framework that is part of our roadmap. And a schema is even a more detailed one. However, there's important things to remember about a schema. A schema is a map for places where we commonly go. And so what we do is, rather than create a brand new map each time, we have a set already drawn up, so we know where we want to go. So when we meet a person, if the person's tall, if the person looks athletic, well, automatically we have a schema of a tall person that's athletic, and we think basketball, but that's not fair. So we have to start challenging some of our schemas. They're not truly biases, but they might be the start of them. And for that reason, we have to understand that they lead to stereotypes. So when we're perceiving others, we can't just go with what feels natural. We have to understand the individuality. Attributions. This can be negative and positive on both sides. Internal attribution presumes that a person's communication or behavior stem from internal causes, such as character or personality. Now, this can be good if it's someone you like. If a friend of yours wins an award, well, they won an award because they have heart. They're smart. They're very good. On the other hand, if someone does something bad to you, you could say, well, they did that because they're mean, when it might have actually just been an accident. So they can be positive or negative. External attributions, a person's communication is caused by factors unrelated. You may hear this in court cases. You may hear this from some of your crime shows that you might watch, where, oh, well, you know, they are not a bad person. It's just the circumstances of it. You know, the bank robbery that they committed, well, it wasn't really their fault, type of thing. It was caused because they were raised on the wrong side of the tracks, or it was caused because of they were watching too many crime shows, something of that variety. So these can be good or negative. It all depends. And so when you start attributing things to people, be careful, pay attention, realize that everyone's is motivated by internal and external factors. The errors we run into, the fundamental attribution error, tendency to attribute others' behaviors solely on internal causes. In other words, they weren't unlucky, they were evil or mean. We see this oftentimes in sports, you know. Oh, well, the other football team won. Well, they won because they're cheaters. They won because they paid off the refs. You know, you hear oftentimes that it's a fault within their character. Actor-observer effect, tendency to make external attributions regarding their own behavior. Well, officer, I was speeding, yes, but I was speeding because I was late for work and I need to get there because it's my job. Well, is that necessarily true? Because if you had woken up 5 minutes earlier, you wouldn't have had to speed. So in many ways, it wasn't an external cause, it was your own cause. Self-serving bias, taking credit for success by making internal attribution. You know, let's say you're in a competition with a friend. You're going to flip a quarter 10 times. And whoever guesses it right the most, well, that person is the winner. Well, you automatically know if you flip a quarter, it's a 50-50 chance, period. And if you guess it correct 6 times out of 10, it's not because you had some insight. You hear this oftentimes with lottery winners. Well, I heard the numbers talking to me. You know, these were my lucky numbers, and and it's no, it was chance. We have other influences on our perception. We're going to get into culture here in a little bit, and culture is huge because we're born into it. We're taught it at an early age. We live it, and we share it. And because of those concepts, it is very important to us. But there also can be the basis of in-groups and out-groups. And we have to realize that culture isn't just, you know, oh, I'm from the Southwest. Well, I'm from the Northeast. It's not a regional thing. There are many cultures, and we'll talk about that later on. In-groups and out-groups are not solely created based on culture. It can be peer groups. You could be in the same group and have an in-group and out-group. We have that in families. You know, there's the rebel of the family. Well, the rebel's the outcast of the family. That's an in-group and an out-group. You can have it at school. You can have it at work. If you work in a restaurant, you know about in-groups and out-groups. That's the kitchen staff. That's just how they are. That's the wait staff. That's who they are. And you have this, but that changes your perception. Because once after you leave the restaurant, you're sitting down at a coffee shop and you're talking to someone and they work in the restaurant too. And you're like, oh, wow, great. We have this in common. And you say, well, I work in the kitchen. And they say, oh, I'm waitstaff. And suddenly you have friction where there shouldn't be one. There are other influences of perception. In-groups, out-groups, sphere of influence. We're going to cover that once after we take our short break. when you come back, or if you just decide to go straight on through, whichever way you want to do it, it's fine. But sphere of influence, we're really going to get into that. That is important about how we perceive others. In groups and out groups, as I mentioned, once again, there can be social influences in there. So this is our preview for what's coming up. Go ahead, take a break. I don't want you to try to go through a half hour all in one sitting unless you really want to. Take that break, come back, and I'll catch you on the other side.